All right. I believe that we are live.
Okay, well, how you doing?
Pretty good. Um, we are today going to talk about having characters interact with stuff, which is one of the things that the ephemeral system does really, really well, actually, and one of the things that's always a huge pain. As essentially a subset of space switching, really, if you think about it, like the whole problem of constraining stuff to characters' hands or vice versa is sort of a subset of the problem of space switching, which isn't really a problem with the ephemeral system. So now we're basically finally going to get to the part of this animation test about a character picking up a heavy object where the character actually does pick up a heavy object. But before we do that, Chris Smith has some more questions for us. So he says, please, can you tell me what is the main difference between your system and someone animating in stepped mode until it reaches a polished state in ones and twos with no interpolation? Is your plan to show us how to mirror transform space blend shapes for more... this is a separate question. I'll get to that in a second. So to answer the first question, the difference is essentially the sorts of things you can do. I mean, it's pretty clear that we're inspired in part by the fact that lots of animators do animate in step mode and fill in breakdowns, and usually people spline stuff eventually, but sometimes they don't. But the problem is that a conventional rig forces you to still have the rig behave in ways that are reasonable for interpolation, which all of the things that the ephemeral system does, where it allows you to manipulate the character in these wildly different ways, to have forwards and backwards manipulation, to be able to stick things to things and unstick them, which is what we're about to see, to be able to generate in-betweens in entirely different ways that don't necessarily have to have anything to do with each other. All of these things require the assumption that you're not interpolating. And if you're using a conventional rig, and I've done plenty of this myself, you're using a conventional rig, and you're doing, step blocking, and you just, continue to do that until you filled out all the frames. I would say that in a lot of circumstances, I think that's much better than using a graph editor. But it doesn't actually solve this big primary issue, right? That is to say, you're still stuck manipulating the character the way that interpolation demands, right? The fact that the relationships between the items in your rig must always work a very specific way and can never be circular and can never have or I should say can never really, when I say being circular, I mean work in apparently circular ways from one moment to the next, because the ephemeral system isn't actually circular, but it appears to be because it just works differently depending on what you have selected. None of that stuff is possible if you have to have every object be in a consistent space for interpolation purposes. So one of the things I would say about this is that when you're talking about how, it's possible to animate in step keep with a conventional rig, you can do that, but you're basically still stuck with a lot of the consequences of needing a rig that supports interpolation. Because the graph, the whole Maya behavior, the behavior of Maya's no graph and the Maya concept of rigging essentially mandates that. Right.
Right. And that's one half of it, right?
Yeah.
Which is manipulating characters in a particular pose, which the ephemeral system gives you, tools that allow you to do that, backwards, forwards, lots of different things, sort of like a lot of different rigs at once that you can switch between. But there's a second side to it too, which is all of the blends and things like blends, the blending and the breakdown, so that you can, and that really does require a concept of poses rather than a concept of curves, right?
Yep.
That's not how Maya is built to do it. And so if you're doing that without those tools and without those concepts, you have to go and you could use some sort of an in-betweening tool, but it's not going to be conscious of nearly as many types of in-betweens and blends, et cetera, as this system is.
Indeed. And fundamentally, you'll be stuck with in-betweening in one particular way, which is to say whatever spaces your rig has things in, right? Even though, in theory, because you're generating new poses, things don't have to work the same way for each pose. In the ephemeral system, they don't. If you're using a conventional rig, even if you're using some kind of breakdown tool, even if you're using A tools or the Tween Machine or any number of other things that people have with the regals, or the old Ansevin breakdown tool, which we had a long time ago, any of that stuff, that's a useful thing. but you're still limited by what your rig is capable of supporting, and the only things it can support are things that would be interpolatable. Is in your plans to show us how to mirror transform space blend shapes for more complex meshes? Sorry, I'm stuck with my contour rig and I cannot find an answer. Yeah, that is an unfortunate limitation of Autodesk's post deformation blend shape system, and it's one that I do really think we ought to address. It's I mean, and I've sort of talked about maybe having that be a future stream where we actually just code one live and then, well, I mean, a code a basic one live anyway. Making tools takes time, but something that at least would be usable, I think we could do, and then making that open source, and making it available to making it, just sort of generally making it available as a way to do that. I don't see that being a feature of Contour because it's not actually about Contour's behavior. This is totally an Autodesk thing. This is their blend shapes basically lacking a feature. So I wouldn't see that necessarily being like part of Contour, but I think it's something we should address.
Yeah, I mean, what state is your code in at the moment, Raf, for that? I know you have some code for it.
I do have some code for it. It's really a mess. Like, it's something I did ad hoc because I needed it, right? And I think I would want to approach it somewhat differently actually for a release tool. The way I ended up approaching it, I think it's a good reference. But I think that what I would like to do is to write a simpler version of it actually.
Sure. I'm just wondering if we can
convoluted.
I'm wondering if we can do something to help Chris out with this specific problem.
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, actually, yes. So this is actually a very good point, which is just because I don't want to like take the system that I the dumb script that I developed and make that public, because it would be hard to maintain and it would be a huge pain. Doesn't mean that we couldn't make it available to specific people in the meantime if you really, really need it. If you'd like to get in touch with us, I could.
If you email us at support, Chris, I think we can at least do that. And if you run into any trouble with it, we can probably give you a little bit of help with it. I don't know if you do any Python scripting, but I would say email us at support, and we'll see if we can figure something out.
Yeah, absolutely, that would be worth doing. And I do think it's something we should address in sort of a more extended way, later on, and we'll see what happens. Before I go on, I just want to double check on something, which is that I was having some mic problems earlier, so I want to make sure my voice is audible. But you can hear me, right, Tagore?
I can. Yeah. I mean, I'm not listening to you on YouTube. I'm listening to you on Discord, but I assume.
Yeah. Well,
I assume that it's working.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I don't know what I was thinking because obviously you've been talking to me this whole time, and if it works on Discord, I'm going to assume it works on YouTube. So yeah.
I was hearing you on YouTube before I muted YouTube. So
okay.
It's
so
just,
then,
I get an echo.
It works properly. Never mind. Okay. So we're going to talk now about glue groups. And what that means. And basically, where we left this last time is like he's at this point where he's gonna pick up the cube. And we never actually got to that bit where he actually picks up the cube because we wanted to look at in-betweening and we wanted to talk about how that works. So actually, this is actually, I think, another point that's worth making, like before we really get into how do glue groups work, is how easy it is to do stuff like this. Because conventionally, animation sort of proceeds by stages. And that's often true of traditional animation as well. I mean, it's been something that's been true for animation technique in various contexts for a long time. You have very specific stages that you go through. It's kind of a waterfall, as people sometimes say in software development, right? Which is to say, you start blocking stuff, you get your blocking approved, you move on to like more blocking and putting in more breakdowns, you get that approved, then you spline it. Probably. I mean, if you can avoid splining it, that's nice, but a lot of the time you can't. And then you clean up all the issues with it, and then you do a polish pass where you're like fixing all the things, and each of these things is this really discrete state. Because once you proceed from one state to the other, it's difficult to go backwards. And one of the reasons why people have adopted the stepped mode sort of methodology, even if you are eventually splining like quite a lot, is because at least as long as things are stepped, you kind of can go back for some bits in a way that's not that crazy. But as animators have been complaining about since essentially the dawn of CG animation, right? Or I should say, not really the dawn of CG animation, but the dawn of the dawn of more traditional animators like going into CG, I think, right, really in the early 2000s. Once you spline, not only does it make everything look bad, but you kind of can't go back. Because a lot of the things you're going to try to do to fix those issues with splines are going to make it very, very difficult to sort of go back in time and change things later. And it's very hard to do something like spline only part of a shot. Because you don't really know what effect the parts you didn't spline are going to have on the parts you did. And the more the more close your blocking is, the easier it is to deal with these things, but it's always a pain on some level. And one of the really nice things about having the concept of poses as these entirely discrete things is that those issues literally don't exist. Right? I can, I went and I in between this section here, and I didn't in between, any of this stuff in here at all. And, I totally left this part here undefined. And, I didn't do anything about the actual part of the shot where he picks it up. I didn't do a single thing about any of that. And it doesn't matter. It's, they're all just poses. There's no reason why this would present any real issues, because everything is sort of, nothing's interrelated. Everything is this totally discrete thing. And if I now want to go in between this, nothing I do here is going to have any effect whatsoever on any of these poses, unless I wanted to, because I'm using re-in-betweening part of it, or in some other way using information from a pose over here to affect something over here. But that only happens when I say it does. It never goes and does that by itself without my permission. And that's, I think, a really critical idea here. So I wanted to sort of bring that up before I get into the other part of what I'm showing. I think what I'm going to do now is, at some point I do want to go back and sort of break down and in between these sections here and sort of add what's going to happen beforehand. But I think I'm not going to do it right now, because that's not really what this stream is about. Right? Now let's move on to having him actually grab and pick up the object. So one of the things that I have done, and I did this in between the streams, so you guys didn't see me do it. And maybe I should have done it on the stream so I could show you how it works. But this is sort of what I'm doing right now. Is that I rigged up the cube with some ephemeral controls, and so the cube itself. Oh yeah, I turned off. 1 second. There we go. The cube itself is an ephemeral control, but it's also got controls at the corners, which lets you do stuff like this or this. That's exactly the kind of thing where that kind of handoff. Oh, that's obnoxious. I realize what just happened there. Ha, I encountered an ephemeral undo issue. One of the many issues that we are in the progress of fixing, and this is an old build. Some of that stuff is fixed now, but for now, this is what it is. Which is that basically you can have these multiple pivots and they all move together and they never come apart, but you can pivot them at any point, right? And that just comes out of the ephemeral behavior. What's actually going on here is that each one of these has both a forward and backward relationship with the main control. So that if I am manipulating this one, the control is backward of it, the main body of the thing. If I'm manipulating this one, the main cube is backward from this, and then all of these other cubes are backward from the main cube. So it's really easy to set up stuff like that with the ephemeral system, and one of the things that one might choose to do for a character, and I generally haven't because it hasn't been particularly relevant to what I've been doing, would be to actually add some of those things just where you think you might need them. Or have the ability to, and this is not something that we have a special tool for yet, but it's something I'd like to do, to just add some ad hoc. One of the things we've talked about is some ways of making the ability to make things ephemeral controls, a little bit more ad hoc. And it's a very possible thing. There's nothing about the ephemeral system that stops you from doing it. It's just a matter of UI and, how we want to establish things. There's nothing about the ephemeral system that prevents the animator from adding additional controls right in a shot. And so that's not what I did here because we didn't really set that up, but there's nothing to stop us from setting that up. And you can imagine how having an ephemeral control that is simply an optional pivot would be a really useful thing in a lot of circumstances. It solves a tremendous amount of manipulation problems. So, here's what we are going to do. So let's start by actually figuring out how he's going to rip the thing, and then I'll start showing you how glue groups work. So he's come over there. I'm going to give him like a big beat of time before he does something else, I think. And he's going to try to lift this, and I'm sort of thinking about like what motion would make sense in terms of him trying to lift it and, you know, it being difficult to lift. And I think one of the things is he's going to try to grip it high over here because it would make like a better silhouette, and low over there, and try to lift it and bring this corner up first. So it's going to end up looking something somewhat like this. I just switched to forward all mode, moving his whole body forward. Maybe he'll even take a step in. Now, what we have previously done is that, you know, he'd come to a stop, but there's nothing saying his feet have to remain where they are. I think that it makes sense that he'd take a step in for this motion. And, you know, as we sort of previously discussed on our initial Ephemeral stream, you know, it probably, in a real context, it would be pretty likely to have some boards or do some thumbnails or have some, like, greater discussion with a director or whoever's in charge. In this case, partly for demonstration purposes, I'm just kind of making stuff up as I go along. Because, again, that's something that you can kind of do effectively with the Ephemeral system that is often harder to do if you're doing things more conventionally. So let's see. Oops, wrong mode. I often really like to use those middle tweaker controls, especially on a cartoony character like this, so that you don't have such straight limbs all the time. So let's see. And you can see me switching modes constantly as I do this. Yeah, I'm going to do something that's going to look super weird from this angle, but that does not matter because we don't actually care what it looks like from that angle. We only care what it looks like from the character's actual, the actual camera view. So if he's really trying to get down low and like get this, yeah, I got to drop him lower. Or I got to bend him lower. Both really, probably. Yeah, I'm going to turn on some onion skinning because I really want to get more of a sense of how this is going to flow. One second. I have a button for that. There we go. I'm going to include the cube this time. There we go. All right. Yeah, this is very nice. Honestly, I don't understand anymore how animators animate without some kind of onion skinning. Like, it matters so much in terms of your ability to actually see and understand what you're doing. Now, of course, part of the issue here is when I set this up, I paid no attention whatsoever to like what actually made sense in terms of the place, in terms of like the size of this thing. Like, how is he actually gonna pick it up? That is okay. One thing I am going to do though is, and here's an example of using how this works ephemerally. I'm going to scoot the whole cube back like the whole time basically. Now here's an answer actually to a question that was previously posed, which is, well, you've got the everything as a pose. And right now, poses are completely unique for both the cube and the character. Because right now, if you want to have like two different characters in the scene, you can totally do that, but they get the same poses. Which, for a lot of cases, like their props or whatever, is fine. In cases where you have multiple characters, or you have props changing hands, or props doing their own thing, being able to maintain their own set of poses that isn't like the same as the character is going to be pretty important. And that's, just one of the additional things we need to tackle, right? Um, and it's not particularly difficult to tackle either. It's just we haven't gotten to it yet. Because a lot of the stuff that I've been animating has been a character and some props, as opposed to like multiple characters interacting. So it was fine for them to share poses. They do need to, in the ephemeral system, share poses during the time when you're interacting with them. When the two characters affect each other. Because if they don't, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the context of the ephemeral system. Or when the character and a prop affect each other. Keeping in mind that these are always two-way in the ephemeral system. We are never really looking here at a scenario in which you're like, oh, I attach the cube to the character. No, I'm attaching them to each other. And you'll see what that means in a second. And as a result, like, there's a little bit more work we need to do to, like, make them not share poses all the time. Right now they're sharing poses, and it's not a big deal in this case. I'm just, sort of getting that initial pose of, like, what's that going to look like when he's trying to lift this thing? But right, what I was saying was, now that I've moved this thing, and the fact that they're sharing poses, we now have this question of, like, well, if this was a conventionally animated thing, I could, like, in the graph editor maybe, even if I had other keys here, I could move it in the graph editor, or if I could just delete keys and recreate them, or I could not have any of these keys, because, realistically, like, this concept of a pose necessitates that if we're using keyframes to represent a pose, then everything must be keyed on that pose. Like, that's the essential concept of what a pose is. It must have data for everything. That's what makes it a pose. And obviously, in conventional keyframing, you don't do that. You would just get rid of all these, right? So how do we do that? Well, we just use our overtime tools. So in this case, I'm going to store a pose. I'm going to turn off blends use all nodes, because I don't want to do this to him. I just want to do it to the cube. And again, it doesn't matter what thing you have selected when you store the pose. It stores everything, only when you apply the pose. And then I'm just going to select all of this. And I'm going to say applied stored pose over time. I actually just wrote a new version of this exact thing, which hopefully I'll be able to show soon. That's a lot faster. So instead of skipping to each frame and doing it directly, it just does it all at once, and it's quite a bit faster and nicer. But, like I said, I'm showing a slightly older version. A slightly older build, even, and I know it's weird to use the term build when we come to something written in Python, but in this case it kind of applies, because we're using something called Nuitka to compile it. Yeah, this is a slightly earlier build, because some stuff is still a bit in flux in that build, and I don't want to, like, publicly show it until I make sure it's actually not broken, in some fact. Not that I'm totally confident about anything until, we have more passes of testing and, stuff, but I'm confident enough about this one, which I've used to animate quite a lot of stuff. So anyway, yeah. So now this is what you're doing, and when it's faster, that'll be even clearer. It's like, you can, as long as you have good tools to affect multiple poses, the issue of essentially not being able to edit this in just one place is not really a serious issue. You can just take your pose data and push it around into other poses if you want to. It's not a big deal. So let's see. I'm just figuring out, like, what is the pose where he actually starts gripping the thing going to be like, because I'm going to attach it at that time. He's got weird hands, and this is making, and one of the things that's sometimes interesting about animation, but also sometimes kind of a pain, is my character design, isn't a person. It's something else. How will he grip something? Well, it's not the same thing a person would do. And sometimes that's frustrating, but it's also kind of exciting, because that's, you're always looking for interesting things to do with motion that aren't just mimicking the real world, as part of what makes animation interesting. So, like, what is he going to do with his thumb? It's kind of a good question, actually. Should he, like, press his thumb up against it, maybe? I could see that working if I push his hand back a little. And maybe extend this out a bit. Here's a contour thing. Just extend it's no big deal. I'm just going to extend the finger out. Contour's not going to have a problem with that. Your conventional rig probably does have a problem with that. Alright, I think that kind of works if we angle this a little bit more, perhaps. Yeah. I think that could work for what that hand's doing. Let's take a look at the other hand. just switch to default mode in case anyone, again, like I do it reflexively and I should really call it out when I'm doing it. I will often reflexively switch modes even if I am already in the right mode, just because my brain says, oh, I want to be in default mode for this thing I'm about to do. So I just reflexively hit A, which happens to be the hotkey that I assigned to it, without really thinking about it or putting any effort into like that thought. It's just like, oh, I'm doing this. I don't know what mode I was previously in. It doesn't even matter. I'm just going to switch to what I want and do the thing. Yeah. Sometimes you do actually care what it looks like in other views, because A, shadows and stuff, if it's way off, and B, he's going to lift the thing, so all right, so I'm now looking at this, and this has to do a lot with like this pose-based way of animating, is that now that I have a pose, I can now start to see how the motion might flow. So I didn't necessarily know exactly beforehand, which, is a little different. Oh, just want standard, there we go. Is a little different in practice. And so I'm thinking about, like, how is he going to do that? I'm going to push this foot even a little more forward, I think. Not that you can really see it, but one of the things, it's pull his hips back a little. Oops, I switched to the wrong control. There, no, wrong mode. There we go. Is he's leaning over this thing where he can't really get his center of gravity into a good position for it, which I think is actually good, because the point here is we want to show this being this sort of ungainly thing. Like, that's kind of the concept that I have here, right? It's not necessarily, you know what? I don't quite like this like angle that the thing is at. So here's a case where I'm going to 0 the rotation of the shoulder partly, just get it back more into its default state. Then I'm gonna sort of push it down a little bit more like this. That's a little bit better. So since he can't get his center of gravity into a reasonable position for this because it's too damn big, instead, he's gonna have to rock it to the side before he can pick it up, which is kind of part of the reason why I added these controls, because I figured I was probably gonna be doing something like this, So he's gonna, let's see. 1 second. That's the cat feeding alarm. Don't worry about it. She is currently being fed by my wife, but, on other days, my cat gets very frustrated if she is not fed. Well, as far as she's concerned, she should be fed like an hour before time, but, she's a cat, so she doesn't get to decide. Let's see. So, yeah, so he's going to do that. And he's primarily using this hand to steady it and pulling with this hand. So if we do another pose, and now is when we're going to start doing glue groups. So here's something I'm going to do. I'm going to do something where I select both of these controls, both of his hands, and I'm going to select the box. And I am going to make a glue group. And what that does is to group these things in such a way that they have now an interdependent relationship. So what that means is the hands will move with the box, but also the box and the other hand will move with any hand. So this makes scenarios in which a character is gripping something. Like, the simple scenario is you're gripping something with one hand. And conventional constraints aren't terrible at that. I mean, they're still kind of a problem. And the problem is, when are they active, right? You go and you grip something, and like, when is that constraint? When does it come on? When does it come off? How does that work, right? You have to manage that manually, just like you have to manage all this other space switchy type stuff in a rig. Like I said, like, constraints that an animator uses during animation are fundamentally sort of a subset of the concept of space switching. We don't necessarily think of them that way, but that's kind of what they are. And that part is obnoxious, but at least you can just be like, okay, and then I'm just going to move my hand around and the other thing will come with it. And that's all very well if your character just picks up like a single object and is just like moving it around or whatever. But characters do all kinds of things, right? That's not like the thing that characters do with props. They do all kinds of things with props. You could be like picking up a prop in two hands. That would be very normal. You could be picking up a prop with two hands and then like propping it on the character's shoulders. Like, who knows? Any possible relationship between the prop and the character is possible. So if that's the case, honestly, your conventional idea of constraints, like the amount of work that the hoops people go through to try to like make that work effectively it's a problem, right? Like there's whole systems that exist for this with their own UIs and their own sort of tool set and way of thinking about things, and it's just something the animators constantly got to pay attention to, and I hate it, right? You may have gotten that impression. So here is here's an example, for instance. So I'm going to break all glue groups. So one thing, we do have to do a little work on this UI, because right now there's no readout of what glue groups exist. And so we made a button that just breaks all of them, because if you don't have a way of choosing which ones to break, because they're easy to make. So for the moment, we need a better UI for that. But for the moment, let's say I wanted a glue group that also includes his upper body, not the lower body, just the upper body. I'm going to take all this stuff, I'm going to glue it all together. And now what I can do is to say I am literally going to do this, and his upper body's going to move too. And I can create and destroy that stuff as much as I want. And here's the important bit. None of it has any effect on anything other than the direct manipulation of a pose that I'm actually doing right now. Which means, for instance, I can turn it off by turning off glue active. And now it's off. If I want to make another pose just for experimentation purposes, right? I turn off glue active, I move it, I turn glue active back on, I move it again. Now, in this particular case, it doesn't seem like all that useful a thing to do. But think about this: you're holding an object, like whatever prop your character is using, and you need to reposition it in the character's hand or reposition the character's hand on it. And it's really worth noting. I think this is a really important point. As far as the ephemeral system is concerned, there is no difference between I reposition it in my hand and I reposition my hand on it. Those are not two different things. They're the same exact thing. They produce the same result. So you have total freedom to think about it how you would like to do it. If you have a character holding a pencil and you want the character to like spin it around or do something, that probably means that you're like, turning off glue groups, moving the pencil around and like adjusting the fingers a bit while you do this, right? Now you've put it on paper and you're like, I need to now I want to change the hand's grip on the pencil. Well, it's the exact reverse thing. Now, if you have a conventional, constraint relationship between those things, that's incredibly painful. Like, but with this, it's a completely natural thing to do. You're free to manipulate things in whatever way you think is appropriate. And one of the things, for instance, like, some of you guys may have seen Little Bird now, given that it came out on Short Night, and I do hope it'll be out like on Vimeo or something at some point, and I can just like put it out for anyone who might have missed Short Night to see. But if you saw it in Short Night, or even if you saw some of the clips from it, I think there's this whole scene where she's like writing with chalk, and this is the sort of thing that is ridiculously easy to do with the ephemeral system, and really painful to do with conventional rigging. Well, conventional animation, I should say, except really it's a rigging problem, right? And the animator is sort of forced to think about it as a rigging problem, even at least on a small scale, by figuring out, like, what's going to be controlled by what. And we don't have that problem. We don't have to figure that out. We can change it whenever we want. So, anyway, I'm going to leave this pose because that was just for, test purposes. We've got this. He's going to rock the thing back. So let's think a little bit now. Glue active is back. Let's think a little bit now about, like, what does it mean to have him rock the thing back? I mean, presumably he's creating this motion, right? This isn't something that the cube's doing to him. So we need to make sure that his body is oriented. I meant that to be in. Oh, that's right. I had grouped them all together. Sort of forgot that for a second. 1 second. Now I don't want that. So I'm just going to have it be, the two hands and the cube. I just broke one and I remade one. And that should all work fine. Now I should be able to move his body without moving the cube. Although I suppose I could have just turned off glue groups again to do that, and that would have worked fine too. But in this case, I actually think this is probably more helpful. Like I said, a little more UI around this will make it a lot clearer. Like, what make it, because you eventually, I mean, you would want to be able to say, oh, I just want to kick a particular control out of this particular glue group. Like, nothing internal to our code makes that particularly difficult. We just have to write some UI for it. All right, let's just take a look at this. Now remember how I talked about how, like, I'm often thinking about things, like, you think about everything, right, all the time. And I find that to be just a much more, sorry. Well, this is what happens when you think about everything all the time. I'm constantly looking at it and being like, now that I see how this works. See, the thing is, like, this motion ultimately has to come from his hips, right? Because if he's grabbing onto the thing and rocking it this way, what's causing that? Like, what part of his body is actually producing the force that creates that effect? Well, he's got no leverage to do that with his upper body. It's got to be his lower body, right? And it's got to be his lower body specifically, like, pushing off with this foot and taking the weight on this foot, which means that we should put this back to being flat on the ground. And probably, here's kind of a useful thing. I'm in default mode. I can, if you zero out this control when it's suspended, it will actually zero out to a suspended position. That's your zero for that part because you're in default mode. Again, super useful things to do with your sliders that sort of fall naturally out of the ephemeral system's conception of how slider and interactions work. All right, so he pulls it back, and now he's got to somehow get it over his center of gravity, which he doesn't really have a great way of doing right now. So let's say he is switched to forward mode. So I didn't mean forward all, I meant forward. There we go. So he's got to be trying to get this thing over his center of gravity in order to be able to try to pick it up at all. Like, that's what makes sense here. And so if he's doing that, then let's say this one gets rotated up by this corner a bit like this. Now here's where we can use that, just turning off glue groups, which is Shift Z. So I did it by keyboard, but he's got to shift his grip here, right? This grip looks super weird from this angle. I just turned off the glue group for a moment so I can change his grip on the thing. Let's say it's kind of like this. I mean, we can feel free to, like, stretch him in ways that don't really make any sense because he's a really cartoony character, but I don't think I want to have him grip all the way down here. That seems a little extreme for, like, a motion that's not super fast. But he is going to angle his body more like this. And probably adjust this to be gripping a little bit more clearly there as well. Yeah, so he's got to kind of rock it back in order to get it over his center of gravity to be able to actually do much of anything useful with it, in order to be able to lift it at all. And one of the things I'm going to do is say that he's actually going to lift his foot just a little bit there. But I think, let's see, does he need to shift his hips back a little bit more? I think yes. Right, because he's got this big, heavy thing here. So he can sort of cantilever himself a little bit to get himself, and I think it really helps sell the weight. The idea that he is kind of like, he's way off balance here if this object wasn't super heavy. That's part of what sells the idea that it's heavy. Right? If he's sort of lifting it up, but he's mostly over his own center of gravity, it's not really the distributed center of gravity of him and the object. All right, so let's look at this. You know what I want to do here? I actually want to shift his foot, because this looks like a very nice place. And here I'm gonna shift it over there too, using a bias. And I'm actually going to take this in backwards mode and bias that too. Or do I not need that to be backwards mode in order for that to work? Huh. All right, well, I'll take a look at that for a second. Whoops, wrong mode. I meant backwards. There we go. Because what I want to do now is to say, oh, he's placing his foot back there in order to... And actually, he's going to already be doing it at this point. Actually, that's the right thing to do. So I have this in backward mode. I really should be able to just blend that, bias that backwards. Yeah, there we go. And maybe even have it be a little bit higher, like that, because... Yeah, there we go. So he's got to... So before as he's going for this, right, and I haven't sort of filled in that bit yet, but as he's going for this, he's got to shift his foot forward. So at some point he is going to be doing that here. I need another pose to elucidate that, right? But then he shifts his foot backward, and that actually means I can bring his center of gravity down a little bit in order to have a place, like right before he makes this move, in order to have a place to shift his weight back onto. And I think that seems more interesting. And it also means that I'm going to bring him down a little bit more. Oops, wrong one. In part because glue active is not on. And also I want it to be in forward mode. There we go. All right, let's see how this is going. All right, so at this point, I wanna smooth over what this knee is doing, because note how it goes from like slightly bent to straight to slightly bent. So as long as I am in default mode, so that it's suspended between the body and the foot, then if I smooth, it's going to smooth to the relative smoothed position between that it was in this pose and this pose, right? Which is like, you know, partly bent. So what I can do here is do this, and it will bend it. If I go all the way, it's going to go to the exact midpoint of those two. So it makes it super easy to like make sure that things are lining up nicely. All right, let's see. I'm going to start filling this out in a slightly different way to figure out sort of how he gets into that position. It seems like this motion is going to end up actually being pretty fast. Something like that, right? He's sort of like rolling it, but like he's got those 2 points of roll. Like that's the sort of thing that's actually really painful to do conventionally, because you've got like it's really common to have a situation where like you've got some object like with different points of contact, and you need to like pull it in this direction and then in another direction. And of course, the problem that you usually get with that is you end up having to set up some sort of controls to do that, or it gets really awkward. But in order to set up controls to do that, you're presupposing an order. It's not unlike, in some ways, it's not unlike gimbal lock. You have an order of operation here. You have an order in which you're applying these rotations. And we don't have an order. We can do whatever we want. So, all right. So how does he get onto the thing? So the first thing he's going to do is take this foot here and scoot it into the position it's going to be in, right? Because that's the first thing, and then as he reaches forward, he's gonna do the other foot, or I should say, as he starts to pull it back, I think he's gonna do the other foot. So he's shifting it. He's shifting his foot forward. Which hand is he gonna grip with first? Yeah, he's going to grip with this hand first. So actually, I am just going to bias that. Whoops, that's right. They are still together. I'm going to turn off glue active and then bias it. Obviously, this looks super weird, but that's okay. Oops. Wrong one. What was I thinking? I meant the elbow. Gonna zero that. Blends use all nodes is off. We're in the wrong mode. There we go. Straightening it out. Because what I want to do here is to give myself, and again, like he's a cartoony character, but he's not so cartoony that I want to have, or at least not in this particular movement, right? Like I mean, he could be in another, like this character would probably do that, right, in another context. But in this particular context, oh yeah, I also need to do his fingers. Wrong hand. If I want to do that. Yeah, there we go. And I'll probably pull it up here a little bit as it's sort of getting into place. Actually, I want to have it pull back slightly. So I'm going to push that forward a little bit and then adjust the thumb. maybe quite a lot. This character has weird thumbs. Right, so you can see his grip sort of settling on it a little bit, is the idea there. And as he's doing that, as he's shifting forward to do it, which probably means his head's going to be a little more back, his ear antenna are going to be a little more back. He's going to be in the process. I remember we were sort of talking about leading with the elbow a little bit. I think I'm going to do a little bit of that here. The one thing that is often useful to keep in mind is the ephemeral system, and this will change once we introduce like actual IK, does not enforce the elbow be pointing in the same direction as the bend of the elbow. Because actually, for a cartoony character, a lot of the time you don't want that. So, along with the sort of the philosophy of don't automate things that aren't actually going to be true all the time, right? It does not make any attempt to mandate that. And for a cartoony character, like, maybe you do want the arm to sort of bend in a completely wacky direction. So I think it's better not to mandate it, but it does mean you have to do a little work doing it yourself, right? So this hand is on the way there. This arm, rather. This looks a little weird. Let me adjust this pose a little bit to, I think, be a little nicer. All right, let's say he's going to be shifting forward. So his head's going to actually trail slightly. I think it's okay now for this arm to sort of be a little weird. I'm seeing some twist in it, though, which probably, comes from the fact that this was not actually aligned properly. Let's see if that's true in these other poses. No, it was fine there. Somehow or other it got out of alignment. And that's perfectly fine, because you got this, like, cartoony character. It's really appropriate to sort of manage. Like, so here's a bit of philosophy. I want there to be manual management of things that are clear and direct, and not manual management of things that are internal or technical. I'm not sure if that terminology really gets what I mean across. But for instance, I hate it when animators have to manually manage, constraints, like we were just talking about, right? Where you have to manually think about what happens when the constraint goes on and off. How do I keep things together? How do I make sure things are in the same place when the constraint animates off or blends off or whatever? Like, I hate that kind of thing tremendously, right? That's all like, horrible cognitive load. Conversely, I think we sometimes go way out of our way to avoid manual interactions with things when it would actually be perfectly fine. And this is that case, because if it is not right, if it is in a weird position, it is immediately visually obvious to me. Now, if this guy didn't have two arms, it would be more so, but yeah.
Yeah, I was kind of going to say something about that, Raph. It seems to me that a lot of the distinction here is what's visually apparent.
Yes.
Right? When you are looking at it, can you see it? And if you can't, it's a pain if you're an animator, if you have to manage it anyway, right? But if you can see it, you just want an easy way to manage it.
Exactly. Right? And even if you had, and really, it's kind of crazy that we don't, even if you had some actual things in the scene, and some animation systems that have existed in the past, I believe XSI actually had something along these lines, did try to represent constraint relationships as some actual visual thing. But even if you had that, you still can't see when it goes on or off very effectively. You can't easily reason about it just from looking at your viewport.
Well, but beyond that,
yeah,
I think that the distinction continues. The end viewer is not going to see that.
Right.
Right. It's what's visually obvious, like, to the end viewer, in a sense, is what I think you want to be manually managing.
Exactly.
Am I wrong about that?
And I think that's a very good way of putting it. And I think that one of the things that I struggle against in rigging in general, and in the way that people sometimes want rigging to work, is trying to automate things that I think are not beneficial to automate, while explicitly not automating things that I think should absolutely never be managed manually, right? It's like, we've got a really weird turned around view of that, where, like, a lot of animators will look at stuff like this and be like, oh my god, like, I have to manage, like, the elbow direction, when it's like, I mean, if it looks wrong, fix it, right? Just change it. It's not really a big deal. Whereas animators often do sometimes want things like foot rolls, which I sort of see as being really detrimental things that you, essentially, because the idea is, like, automating uh, the elbow direction is well, really, I kind of got lost in my analogy here because really they're the same thing, right? Which is to say, you're trying to automate things that aren't actually beneficial to automate, but then you've got to track a whole bunch of stuff in your
Right.
head that is not, you should never have to track.
So you know the ideas, that people talk about a lot in code, for instance, around like essential complexity and incidental complexity, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to some degree, it seems similar. It's sort of like what's essential is what you see, and like the direction of the elbow is sort of what you see. What's incidental is that you're using constraints to get there.
Right. Right, and a whole bunch of the stuff that we're trying to do with the ephemeral system is exactly about like what you see is what there is. And that goes back to what we were just talking about the relationships between things, about the fact that there's only one control per control. Like, if you're using a reverse foot, it's the same thing as if you just positioned the foot and rotated it down. Like, there's no difference between those things. How you got there doesn't matter. And I think that's a really essential point. So, okay, he's shifting his weight forward, which means that his body's staying perfectly in place like that. Obviously looks super weird. You don't want that. Let's adjust that a bit. And he's got to be, so at this point, he's taking his weight on that forward foot. So he will have a pose where he like shifts the foot out a little bit so he can take his weight on it. And in that case, I think it's very appropriate to have this be raised a little bit as he is shifting his weight forward. Like all his weight's over basically on that foot at this point, I think. And maybe I will even shift him forward a little bit more. So we'll deal with how he gets into that pose again in a second, but you can sort of see how that idea sort of shifts there, and then he's actually, and here I think I actually do want to make this a little straighter. Like one of the things here, of course, is that I'm talking about manually managing things. I'm manually managing keeping this character on model, right? The rig doesn't enforce anything about that, and that wouldn't be appropriate for all characters, and it's something we're going to deal with in the ephemeral system. But it is not what we're dealing with wrong mode. It is not what we're dealing with right now. So at this point, I'm actually going to say, by this pose in that case, I want to start shifting his weight a little bit back. Because he's now, he's gripped onto the thing. And he's shifted his foot, like, as he puts his hand there. Like, there's, like, this, so it's a little weird here, because he's doing both of them at once, because I've only got two poses here, but we're about to deal with that. And then he starts taking his weight onto his other foot, right? So how does he get between those? So then it comes down to that other question, right? What's the next question to answer? And that's always sort of how I think about posing. What's the next thing I don't know about how this is going to work that I need to make sure is clear? And I actually don't think it's this here, although I'm sort of sorely tempted to sort of tunnel vision on this bit here. I think it's, what happens when he actually lifts the thing up, because that's actually kind of a critical bit here, isn't it? That we have not really addressed. So let's turn glue active back on, which means that I can do, if I do forward, right, I've switched this to this spine to forward all, and I can shift everything back this way. Again, like, I dare you to try to do this kind of stuff with a conventional rig without going way out of your way to, like, reset up a bunch of relationships between things, or just like manually try to keep them together from pose to pose. It's so hard to do. It's so much extra stuff to do this conventionally, and it's so easy to do this kind of thing with the ephemeral system. All right, so at this point, the idea is like he's probably going to be a little off balance, right? He's picking up this thing, and I'm probably going to have it end up on the other side of his body. So at this point, like this foot is coming off the floor like this or something like that, right? He's barely controlling his weight. I'm going to shift this over to here because it does, like I said, like, yeah, the primary thing is how he appears in the viewport, but it doesn't mean that it never matters like how his body is situated in other views. It's just, less important. Because you do have shadows, and you do have like shading that indicates distance, and you do have stuff that will, if it's egregiously wrong, will look weird. So okay, so he picks it up, it's probably gonna come down a little bit like this, because like he's not gonna be able to, or he might actually yes, he might actually keep it up there. If we think about this thing as an arc, and I think this is how I'm gonna do it, that's gonna come around to, so like he picks it up and he's gonna swing it, right? Because like it's got some momentum now. He's shifted it backwards. And actually, I might even want to go further with that. And then, I'm not planning to have him fall over, although that is a classic thing to do in one of these, move an object, lift a heavy object animation tests, have your character fall over. But I'm not actually doing that here. Partly because it's kind of a cliche at this point, I think. So here, I think I am going to push it more back towards his body. I'll figure out what to do about his head in a moment, or maybe more like this. Something like that. I don't know. I'm feeling it out. What happens when he lifts this thing up? Well, one thing I can do is actually shift his hips back a little bit. I'm not that worried about pass-throughs right now. And then I'm going to have, as he did that, right, he'll have shifted his grip. Because you can sort of imagine you're picking up a heavy object, and like as you lift it, you scoot your hand under. Whoops, wrong thing. Had to turn off. There we go. Makes it very easy to shift the position. AA says, speaking of getting off model, let's say for second half of the shot, you end up having his spine twice as long as it should be and don't realize it. Is there an easy way to fix that to that time range? The answer is yes, actually. So you've seen how I can use 0 to push things back towards being on model. So you can also 0 over time. So and I might show this shortly. I mean, that could easily happen, right? I kind of don't want to like go off and do like a whole separate thing to show that, but this is how it would work. Like, so you've got your 0 thing that says like, oh, I'm gonna reduce my thing to correct proportions. And the way you do that is you zero just using translate. So that essentially it's zeroing to sort of like how far am I along a limb or something like that, right? So when you do that 0, you can apply that over time, just like any of the, I mean, really, I don't think there's any sliders here. Well, all right, bias over time wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense as we have it now. Ultimately, bias over time is going to become a concept called time slip, which I am eager to implement but haven't gotten to yet. And you probably are hearing a lot of that around the ephemeral system right now. There's a lot of things I want to do with it that are difficult to do because it's not like we're working on this full time, right? But the equivalent of doing bias over time would be like actually scoot your poses or parts of your poses forward in time through the poses, if you want to think of it that way. It's not too dissimilar from something that Animbot does, actually, where you're sort of shifting. You're not, and it's very important. It's the reason why people use Animbot for this tool, which is the classic idea of shifting keys forward in time. Of course, messes things up terribly, especially if you have step blocking, right? Especially if you're doing something semi-interpolationlessly, as people often do in conventional animation, and so it's like what do you right. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. I've had a long day. I need to drink some Red Bull now. 1 second. Okay. Anyway, lost my sentence there, but I think you saw where I was going. I will now answer AA's next question. Does it blend all towards the 0 or offsets your pose while keeping animation and texture data? So it's basically the latter. And right, yeah, so AA also says time slide while keeping keys in the same spot is awesome. Exactly. It is awesome. There's a reason why people do that, and it's absolutely something the ephemeral system should do. We just haven't done it yet. Because, right, here's what I was saying before. The idea of shifting keys or of shifting information in time as a way of refining your motion is actually a really good idea. Now, when I'm animating conventionally, I generally don't do it because it is so terrible. Right? You can't do it if your stuff is stepped, and if you do it when your stuff is splined, you'll just make things harder and harder and harder to reason about. But it's a great concept. It's just the keyframes make it terrible. So what can you do about that? Well, you can do something similar to what Animbot does, right? It's you take some data from previous keys and you shift it over to the next ones along to some percentage. And that's absolutely exactly the kind of thing you can do with the ephemeral system. It's probably not going to be that hard to implement when we get to that. It's basically bias over time. So to answer the earlier question, though, does it blend all toward the zero or offsets your pose while keeping animation anim texture data? So I'm not quite sure what you mean by texture data. Oh, anim texture data. I see what you mean. I was about to say, like, that doesn't have anything to do with image maps, but you meant like the texture of the animation. Sure. The answer is pretty much the latter, because what it's doing is it's applying that zero to some percentage, like whatever percentage you've chosen, over time. And that's happening both in context of the rig of like whatever state the ephemeral system is in right then. So if you think about it, if you've got an arm moving around and like at some points it's like too long, well, when it reduces that length, it's relative to the elbow if you're in forward mode, and you might do that. You probably do that in forward mode. So all of that motion and the relative relationship of those two things is still sort of somewhat present. It's just that particular axis, right, the axis of length gets reduced and pulled back to like a specific amount, while everything else sort of remains the same. And and in addition to that, of course, you're not necessarily doing it in full, right? You can do it 50% or whatever. So it's all like pretty. I should set up like a good example of that at some point and sort of show that. But and I do think there are improvements that can be made to it too. But like basically, the short answer to what you're describing is yes, you can absolutely do that. You can take whole sections of the shots and push them back to be more on model. You can do a lot of stuff to whole sections of the shots. A little earlier, you saw me. I mean, I don't know if you were personally on the stream at that time, but the stream in general, like I did that. I did something kind of similar to the cube, where I was like, well, I changed it in one pose. I want it to be the same for all the other poses. I just made it do that. Basically, having good tools to relate poses to each other is really, really critical and sorely, sorely lacking. Like, I honestly feel like a big part of Animbot's success, and I sort of think of Animbot as being sort of like a solution to some of those central issues with rigging and animation that just did what it could with what it had, right? Which is to say conventional rigging. I'm trying to sort of take a bit of a step beyond that and say, you can actually get rid of a lot of these problems in full by doing something an entirely different way, but, it's going to be a long time till that's viable in a lot of the production context in which people use Animbot, right? So it's sort of like a way of getting, I think some of its popularity, though, has to do with being able to, in some ways, relate poses to each other. Something that there aren't actual tools to do in general in our animation software, right? All right, so he's gonna get underneath his chin, gonna like that. He's gripping onto the thing. What am I gonna do with that thumb? I don't really know yet. Might pull it back, but there's a limit to how much you can do that without it like looking kind of weird. Yeah, this seems to be working okay. Let's see how this looks. Yeah, I can push this back over here actually. Yeah, you know what? That thing of pressing the thumb up there, that's not quite working for you. But you know what I can do is I can actually again, like here's a contour thing, right? Is that it is always, whether or not you deliberately chose to do it that way, you always have the option of changing the length of your bones and having things respond nicely. This is so critical. In conventional rigging, you can get stuff like that, but you got to do it explicitly. And if you were doing it for fingers, your rig would probably be ridiculously overbuilt. With contour, you just do it anytime you want. Doesn't matter, right? It'll always work. Let's see.
Yeah, the two really do. They work well together,
Yep.
the two systems.
So, okay, let's say he scooted his hand under there as he was doing it, but now we're going to look at that momentum. So here's like the fun part, in my view. It's like, what happens after he does this? And I'm actually, one of the things I'm going to do is that I'm going to like pull him, whoops, I had turned off glue. I'm going to pull him up a little bit more like that. I'm just sort of like, every time that happens, I just want to call it out and be like, yeah, it wasn't quite right. I did something slightly wrong. So I just undid it, hit a button, did the right thing, right? This will get even easier when we have better UI to like know what state you're in. But it's still like if you have your constraints wrong, now you've got to go and like rethink about a bunch of things and figure out and make some connections between things. You don't just get to hit a key and be like, oh no, this is what I wanted. So right, so he's doing that, and then what I want to do is so I'm thinking about the arc of this cube. Actually, one second. I'm gonna adjust the. I don't know how visible the these onion skins are to you guys, so I'm gonna adjust that a little bit. Which one of these is that? That wasn't the onion skin one. That's the onion skin one. Sorry, it's off the screen. Let me just. I'm just gonna make them. Yeah, I think that maybe having them be pretty noticeable is actually the right thing here. All right. Yeah, that's a lot better. You're going to be able to see him a lot better, I think. I don't know. That might actually be too much. It might be a little distracting. There we go. So, all right. So, there's actually a few things I want to refine about that. But before I do it, I want to figure out what he's going to do here. So, I think he's going to switch feet here. Because I'm looking at the momentum of this. So you can sort of see like the cube comes up like this. And so now it feels to me like it comes down and around. And like maybe he actually turns around. Like maybe he does a full 360, like can barely control this thing turn as he's sort of holding onto it and it's coming along with his body and motivating his momentum. So in that case, I'm going to do something rather wilder here, I think. Which is, all right, so here's one thing I'm going to do. I'm going to rotate. Actually, I don't think I'm going to do it around that foot because I think he's going to change feet as he does this. So maybe I'll use like the middle of his body or something. It doesn't matter. Switching to, no, that's the wrong one. I'm switching to world. And so for this pose, I'm sort of thinking, yeah, I'm going to have him be like all the way around here. He'll have switched which foot is on the ground. And basically his momentum, I'm thinking about this, is going to like drag this thing all the way around. Like he's almost losing control of it. And that foot that's outward, like, should not be this foot. It should be the other one. So I'm going to say that his foot, like he's basically pivoting along this foot, which is now on the ground. And, you know, what I'm doing right now is probably not super evident yet. Because I sort of have this idea, now that I've seen these poses, about how this can run. But until I get a couple of poses in there... I mean, this is why, if you was talking to a director, I might do some thumbnails or something, right? You know, that is actually a really good idea. But, you know, maybe we'll make it a little bit more clear. Man, he looks so modern art right now. It's, like, not what he actually should look like. I'm gonna... put that foot a little bit more forward. Oops, wrong mode. And it's okay if he's like really off balance here because he's really off balance here. Switching to forward mode because I can do that anytime I want to. So think about this. So it's like I'm thinking about this arc coming up and around. So right now, like his like body mechanics is all weird right now, but think about it this way, I think, and then also, you know, obviously this is totally wrong. Got to think about his ears in a second. But right now I'm not. This is probably a kind of a strange angle here, it looks like. Just going to put that and figure out what I want that to look like. That's looking a little twisted. I'm thinking there might be something a little weird about the deformation there. Did I turn on... maybe I didn't. Maybe I forgot to turn on inherit twist for this thing right here because you can see how that looks a little weird. I'm not gonna deal with it right now, but like we're seeing like a tiny bit of candy wrapping there, and we shouldn't be. So that should be fixable. Oh, I see what's going on here. This thing is actually rotated way over. So it actually was like twisting like way more than you'd expect. Partly this is because this character has like total tube arms. So things that would be totally evident about like what direction his knee is pointing with like Aaliyah or other characters aren't super evident with him, and so you can get something where it's like way over there and like things are a little weird and twisted, and the reason is just that it's like twisted way further than it you think it is. Again, an okay thing generally to manage by hand because you have control over that. And it should be immediately, most of the time with most characters, immediately visually evident if it's not right. So, right, so he's like this. So, all right, so he's picking it up. He nearly loses control of it, switches his feet in the process. So, like, this foot is going to come back here as the other one comes around. And then I think, let's see where he's going to end up. I'm actually going to start from this pose to figure out where he's going to end up, because I think it's actually a little closer to what we'll end up with. And yeah, let's think about this. So he's going to put that other foot down, come around, and actually, what I see happening here is that I've got the wrong mode. Partly has his back to us, actually, at the point at which he stops. Like I said, this probably doesn't look like much yet. Like, you're like, how do these things relate to each other? Well, it will be, like it'll become more evident. I mean, obviously there's stuff to clean up about this post here. This is not a great post. But I'm trying to get now more of a sense of, like, how is this actually going to run? Yeah, here's what I'm going to do. Yeah, he's going to end up with it kind of like this, with that other foot back there. These feet are obviously, like, all weird right now. So this is actually kind of an interesting thing that I want to bring up here, which is the various advantages and disadvantages of the CG concept of posing versus the being able to draw stuff. So being able to... One of the things that's always frustrated me about CG is that it's not fast like drawing is, right? Because really, as a drawn animator, you can rough something out incredibly fast. Now, locking that all down and, like, cleaning it up, that can be really time-consuming, right? But you can just be, like, scribbling and, like, get your motion down. And even with the ephemeral system in CG, like, that's actually really hard to do. Like you can't rough... I mean, and I should say that's not quite true, because there are some things people are experimenting with VR, actually, that kind of do let you rough things in that way. But with a full rig, even with the ephemeral system, it's still not as fast as, like, being able to just rough in a sketch, right? But you do get some other advantages for it, which is that you have this ability, this tweakability. And tweakability can be a dangerous thing, actually. Like, part of the reason why animation tools are so screwed up is by the assumption that you should always maintain tweakability no matter what, right? With the idea that, like, oh, I can adjust this little curve and it's still there and you can tweak it. And this actually has, in my view, like, terrible consequences, right? But the other thing about it is that it can also be an advantage, right? And one of the things that's really worth keeping in mind, especially for someone like me who's so focused on, like, how come CG sucks so much compared to, traditional animation, which is definitely a thing that I think, a lot of the time, is that it does in a lot of ways, but that doesn't mean it has no advantages of its own. And one of the things that is kind of an advantage with CG a little bit is that, yeah, I mean, you can tune poses in a way that you can't really with a drawing. I mean, you sort of can a little bit in a way, but it's not necessarily easy to do. Like, there's a tunability here that is actually kind of a valuable thing. And so you kind of want to use the nice bits of that, the parts of that tunability that are actually valuable, without losing without introducing things that really, really aren't valuable, which is, generally where I think things are at, right? A lot of the time. AA says, any plans to draw to pose for this setup for either characters, rigs, limbs, or things like ropes? So I have opinions about sort of drawing-based control of rigs. There's certainly something people have tried, sometimes with some success. But I think that they represent some real issues. And a lot of those issues have to do with Z-depth. Most of the areas where I've seen that really work, actually, and I think this is absolutely worth exploring, but it's not something I'm exploring right now, is in VR. Because a big part, like, people have had a long time this idea, like, well, what if you could just sketch the spine, right? And with some success, right? I think Pixar did something along those lines for The Good Dinosaur. They had these characters with long necks, and you can get some useful things out of it. But the problem that I've always seen with it is, like, well, that's all very well, but where do your controls really go? Because a drawing is two-dimensional, and your controls are not. Your controls are in three-dimensional space. So you make that drawing, what does that really mean? It's probably something that isn't really going to end up being quite what you want, because where should those controls go in Z depth, right? It's inexact in that respect. It leaves out a big part of what you're actually trying to figure out. Now, that doesn't mean it's not useful, because you can absolutely see circumstances where you'd want to be able to do that and then sort of tweak it to be, at an appropriate distance. Like, you could sort of see that being possible. But right now, I sort of feel like, I think that's really worth exploring. I think it's something that is, absolutely a potentially valuable thing, but something that I'm not really focused on right now, because I feel like you need this first, almost, right? If you want it, you need to be able to pose fast in 3 dimensions. And it's possible that using some sort of sketch-based posing on top of that would actually be really valuable. Like, definitely I could see that being potentially so. But I feel like we need to solve all these problems first. So I guess the answer is, I think draw to pose is potentially a valuable thing. I think that it is not what I want to focus on right now. But I would definitely not discount it as like something that could actually be really valuable. Switching glue active off with Shift Z so that I can repose his hand on there. This is so, I know I'm talking about my own thing here, right? And so it's like, every time I'm like, my God, do you see how easy this is? It's probably a little silly, but it is so easy compared to like I am definitely having to do right now because of, the context of my job, right? I work for the 3rd floor right now, and, it's not like, I have to do some stuff that isn't, it isn't ephemeral, right? That's the context of production right now. And it hurts me, right? I'm just like, oh God, this was so painful to do. It would have been so easy, but we're not really ready to have this be something that goes into a big production yet. Although I'm hoping we will be, sometime soon. But there's more stuff that needs to be done. It's just probably pretty clear from these streams that we don't yet have something that is going to be like, yeah, you could do like a big production with this. But that we're not that far away from it, right? You can sort of really see it from here. All right, so I think I'm sort of refining, like, how does he get into this pose? Gonna change this for sure. Bring that elbow down. It's not actually that important because you don't really see it, but maybe you want to see it, like, peeking up above there in his final pose. Like that. Something. And this stuff got all weird. Let's push all this back to a reasonable place. This stuff doesn't matter in terms of deformation, which is why I didn't notice it. It really only matters in terms of lining up your axes for like rotation purposes. That's the only place where that actually matters. These particular controls in terms of how they're controlling the deformation rig. So I don't really care about it that much. Like, it'll calculate twist properly regardless of what they're doing. But I kind of do want to get them doing like a reasonable thing. I think I want to keep this a little straighter. Yeah. You want to hunch his back slightly more? Yeah. Gonna do something that is very clearly non-physical because he's a cartoon character and we can do stuff like that. Here's a case where, like, probably needs a little cleanup. Wasn't paying a lot of attention. Oh, I see. These are actually not quite straight here. Let me switch to forward mode and zero them out. There we go. That's better. I think that'll work. Some people really care about having their controls like aligned to worlds so that you can sort of place them down, and I don't really care about that because your controls are gonna. Your foot's gonna do all kinds of stuff, right? Being flat on the ground is just one of the many, many, many things your character's foot is probably going to do, and like that's also. And so I don't really care that much if they're angled in. There's nothing about the ephemeral system that defines whether they should or shouldn't be angled. That's like, they could be whatever, but I don't care very much about having them be angled because essentially because I don't think it matters, right? Anything you do with the foot, like your character's foot being flat to the floor, it's just one of the many, many places your foot can be, and sort of goes again to this idea that I dislike of rigging for specific contexts that are not necessarily your actual contexts, and the ways in which that makes things difficult. Um, and the assumption, right, that if you rig for the most common case, like your foot is flat to the floor, that's necessarily going to be correct, even if it makes things very, very difficult for some of the other cases, because your foot could be doing all kinds of stuff. Who knows? So I don't really care. All right, so I'm gonna say that's gonna be this arc where he's coming around. Obviously, this is all bad. This is gonna be, but I think you can sort of see where I'm going with this. Maybe at this point, where he he pulls it up. No, I did not intend to answer that. It was a robocall. He picks it up. He loses control of it for a second. It spins him around, and then he kind of gets control of it. And I might even aim him back a little bit here if this is the pose that he's finally going to get into. But gotta turn on my glue again. There we go. And I'm really thinking here, although again I don't think you can tell it just from these poses, of the arc of this cube, right? As it comes around and finally settles as he gains control over it, right? So now we can pay some attention to this pose, now that we have some idea of where it's going. That's kind of why I kind of left this one in a half-formed state while I sort of worked on this, so that I had a sense of here's where he's trying to get to. And this is a little bit the opposite animation approach from what I was taking over here. So what I was doing when he was doing all this stuff was I did have a pose that he was going towards, but a lot of this stuff was very straight ahead. I talked a little bit, last stream about Seamus Culhane, and this difference between pose to pose and straight ahead animation, and how straight ahead is this thing that sort of got forgotten, not completely forgotten, but wasn't really a thing people were thinking about very much in terms of CG. But which can be valuable. But one of the nice things here, just as you can in drawn animation, is that you can mix and match those ideas, right, very easily. What I'm doing here is very pose to pose. What I was doing here was actually kind of pose to pose, but kind of straight ahead. And it is totally okay to create these poses in any order and with any kind of sort of methodology that makes sense to you. And when I'm talking here about methodology, one of the nice things about the ephemeral system is that this question of methodology has no technical implications, right? It's not a methodology I'm going to do these things that are going to have these particular consequences in the scene. They're all just poses. It's a purely artistic methodology of I'm going to do things in whatever order makes sense to me artistically in terms of defining what's going to happen in this shot. It frees you from those shackles of as we were talking before, once you spline, good luck going back from that, right? It's such a pain. It frees you from those shackles of having technical implications to the order you choose to do things in, and that possibility, that common possibility of painting yourself into a corner. And all these ideas are kind of somewhat related, right? It's sometimes hard to get them across sort of in full and what all of their implications are. But it is, all right. Sorry, I kind of trailed off there, but I'm really thinking here about okay, how to sort of sell this pose, because like I said, this pose is awkward right now. Because if the thing is dragging him, right? That's the idea, is that its momentum is what's dragging him around. Let's pull it over here more. Turn off my glue, again, Shift-Z, so that I can repose this hand. But, like I said, not that I'm doing it in this particular case, but you can repose the hand to it, you can repose it to his hand. As far as the ephemeral system is concerned, there's no difference between those two things. It's very relative, right? It's if you, I don't know. I was going to try to make some sort of relativity joke, but I couldn't think of anything. But, it is basically, it's it doesn't matter what viewpoint you're taking it from, right? It's all the same thing. I'm not really knowledgeable enough to make physics jokes. All right, so actually one of the things I see that I would like to do here is have him already be bringing this foot back a little bit Yeah, I like that. Let me, oops. Let me make that work a little better. Yeah, we're starting to get somewhere here, I think. Wrong one. There we go. With the idea that this is, actually, I might even do it. Yeah, I'm going to do it way more. Have it come up and around. And then what you can see here is it's like, you know, his foot's going to end up, yeah, that foot's going to end up coming down right there as he gets control over it. I like that. I think that's got kind of a nice arc to it. Like, again, little hard to see. Like, so if I wanted to show this concept to a director, I probably would not just show these poses, because I feel like, although I have an idea of how this all goes together, like unlike something like this where it's like, oh, you can totally see like what this is going to be, right? You know, you can imagine what this is going to be like when you do it. This I feel like you kind of can't, and so I would flesh this out with a few more poses, as I'm about to do, right? So that does, and I sort of touched on this last time, come back to this idea of like, you always want to be showing people something that is visually indicative of your final result. And then you don't want to be showing people stuff where you got to explain it. I mean, some explanation's okay. I mean, it's hard to do this perfectly, right? But you, generally speaking, want to produce something where someone can see it, and even if they don't understand all the details, even if those aren't present, they get the context. And they like, you can look at it, and actually, so this was a little sidebar here, right, about animation technique. This was actually what I realized when I first started doing pose to pose, because when I started animating, just like, everybody else at that time, and by that time I mean the 90s, right? I was doing stuff at first where I was kind of animating the hips, and very clearly, like immediately, I was like, oh, this is really hard, right? So then I started doing stuff that was really ad hoc, right? Where it was like, well, I'll kind of do a few things through the scene. Like, it's not just the hips. Like, I'll sort of like, sort of try to refine some parts of it, and some of it, I was doing everything spline from the beginning. Like, I definitely was not doing poses. And like, everything was like super wishy-washy. And I was like, well, I'll sort of like, that doesn't really look good, but maybe if I like tweak it around, and like I'd just be looking at like, the spine basically, and being like, does this really work? And then once you got the arms into it, it usually didn't, and then you ended up like going back and trying to like wiggle around with these things. And a lot of people had this experience, which is why people switched to pose to pose. And when I did that, I actually really recall that experience of like so feeling this like this revelation, right? Where I did some poses, and I started to understand how to do that a little bit, and I wasn't very good at it yet, right? And largely because I'd read an article written by Keith Lango, who, and this was like back in 2006 or something, who had sort of written up how he had written something on like offsetting keys as a method of animation, and then he sort of repudiated it and wrote this other article being like, actually, I was wrong about all that stuff. Poses are the way to go, right?
2006, Raph. That's later than I would have expected.
No, it actually before that. I mean, it's not that I never did poses before that, but I didn't really understand the concept of doing breakdowns and doing like a lot of poses to be able to visualize your stuff. Like, it's not like I never did poses at all. But yeah, in 2000 it would have been a little earlier than that. It was about 2005. But the point is, sometime in the mid 2000s.
Still later than I would have expected, actually. But yeah, go on. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to break in.
But
it's interesting.
And when I truly tried doing it, where it was like, it wasn't just like, oh, you're starting from a few key poses and then you spline and then you work with it. It was like, you literally make lots of poses. You make like, lots of, you do actual breakdowns and stuff. And that was really the first time I really tried to do it that way, where I would do things like put the finger motion in the poses, do the facial expressions in the poses, don't leave that for later, And the fact that I did that, and within a matter of hours, I was like, oh, I can sort of understand what this shot might be like. Like, I actually know, instead of guessing and turning out to be wrong, right? It was astonishing to me. And it, affected my, as is probably clear, like my experience of doing animation forever after. I was like, no, it's essential to be able to understand, to have, yourself, certainly, everybody else who's working on a production, like, be able to look at this thing, and without having to go through a lot of notes and explanation of what you're attempting to do, understand what it's going to be and be able to judge it. Like, it's critical, and it took animation that was incredibly painful for me to begin with, because while I was always like, I was always, I've been an animator basically more or less my entire life when you get right down to it, right? Like I started doing actual animation. Well, I started doing actual animation of some sort, right, when I was like 8. Right, but obviously this was not CG at the time, right? This was me doing like little stop motion tests and stuff. But like I've always been an animator on some level, right? But it was at that time when I really tried to do something with like closely added poses, like not just like a few key poses, but like really define the motion that way, where animation stopped being something that I feared on some level, because that experience, which lots of young animators have, I mean, and people overcome it in various ways. This isn't necessarily everyone's experience, but like that experience of being like, I'm excited about this shot, but I also know I'm heading into this morass, right? Like I'm heading into a war zone and I don't know what's going to happen. And is it going to be good? Is it not going to be good? Like, I don't know. And I won't know for a long time. And if it turns out to be bad, and then I've painted myself into a corner where it's hard to fix, then it's going to be hell, and I'm going to hate it, right? It had that thing of animation actually being like both something I really wanted to do because I like loved and love creating animation, but also something I feared. And it went from that to being like, oh, I can do stuff and I can know if it's going to be bad right away. And if I throw it away, that's maybe okay. And everything about the ephemeral system, in part, is about taking that even further. Because while that was true compared to my old techniques, it was still true that it was really easy to paint yourself into a corner, right? I was still using techniques where, like, yeah, I did a lot of breakdowns, but I would also do a lot of splining, and there was a lot of ugly stuff that went along with that, and it was hard to do. It was 10,000 times better than it used to be, but it was nowhere near as good as it could be. And the ephemeral system, on some level, is me looking at that and being like, why is it still kind of bad? Like, if I can see how much better this is, how much better could it be? Maybe it could be so much better than even these like somewhat better techniques, But yeah, it's been a long journey for me to like understand how to animate well, and it did not come easy to me my whole career. I mean, it doesn't really always come easy to me now, right? I mean, I imagine based on some of the comments I've seen that like a lot of animation students or younger animators, some of them looked at the stream and been like, how are you just sort of doing this without like a lot of like reference or consideration or like, thought? And of course, partly it's experience. And partly it's because this particular thing doesn't have a lot of constraints on it, right? It can still be hard to meet a director's requirements and to communicate what they want to communicate, right? It can still be hard if this shot wasn't kind of throwaway, like it, and I wasn't just kind of screwing around. It could be hard to figure out like what was the right performance, right? I'm not really engaging on this stream with like the really difficult parts, the high level ideas, right? Of like, how does this fit into the movie, right? What does this character's performance communicate in terms of their character arc, like, or in terms of their attitude, and like the need to like grapple with those problems, right? Animation's still hard, but but you don't want to be grappling with those inherently difficult artistic problems and also be grappling with this whole host of other problems, right? So anyway, sorry, that was like a big sidebar rant there, and probably I took way more time on that than I should have.
It was. I should note that it is 5:35, so we may want to think about.
I can go a little bit longer. I did not get nearly as far here as I expected, once again, because I spent a lot of time talking. But I think I will go a little further in adding a couple more poses, because I kind of want to leave this in a place where you can sort of see how this motion would come together. Although, it's gotten to a point where at least there's some sort of concept of that. And actually, before I do that, I'm actually going to do a little bit of refinement on these, because again, and that's worth doing, even though I haven't filled out the whole motion, because it leads to greater understanding. Let's see. AA says, if you were to get a note, can you think of a scenario where it would be easier to fix with the Graph Editor Maya rig versus Ephemeral rig? Right now, the only scenario where I see that being the case is where you have to make a significant offset to a section of the shot, which is something we have not addressed yet, really. Right? This whole thing about, like, what if his hips were just higher for, like, a whole section of shot? That's something that's still a little difficult to deal with the ephemeral system, and it doesn't really have to be. It's something we've talked about before. about needing to have a good way of describing, because like technically speaking, that's something the ephemeral system can do rather easily. But how do you communicate what that offset is? Like there's sort of a GUI problem with that, and there's an animator presentation, like how does the animator author that information problem? And that's something that can still be difficult with the ephemeral system. It's something we need to address. So I would say that that's a scenario where, you know, it would still be easier right now, although this will not be true too much longer, to fix with the graph editor and a more conventional Maya rig. I would also say that certain kinds of very subtle motion, um, in in theory, like interpolationless animation would be very appropriate for those. But the inability to see multiple poses while you do across time pose operations kind of holds it back a little bit. This is something that would be very, very difficult to do in Maya. So those are the areas I would say where there's still a bit like yeah, you could say like, okay, a graph editor does let you do a couple of things more easily. I don't think it's worth it for all of the things that graph editors are super bad at, you know. But you know, I would say that those are the questions. Those are some things that still need to be addressed. All right, so one of the things I'm going to do a little bit is like again, and this is a little bit weird because you conventionally look at this and say, oh no, sorry, I mistook which direction he's coming from. This should be back like that. Yeah, I'm actually going to look at this. It's like why are you looking at the ears instead of doing that pose? Because it all flows together, right? Like this goes back to that question of you are always looking at everything. There is never a point at which you're like, you know, we're just going to ignore. I mean, that's actually not true. There are some incidental things that a character might have that you would just sort of be like, oh, I'm going to look at this later. But it's not, you know, generally speaking, I do want to, including questions about like, what's his head going to be doing at this point? I do want to look at everything all the time on some level and be like, what does this mean? Now, this is going to end up being way out here because that's the pose he eventually settles into. All right. So here, let's start doing this bit. I'm going to put it back into default and I'm going to make a breakdown. Ha! Shouldn't do that in default mode. That should be forward mode. That's a bit better. Oh, I turned off glue active. No wonder that didn't work. That's better. Now his hand, you'll note, you see how his hand is still shifting and like not adhering to it? So the reason for that is that the hand's in a different position at this point than it is here. It was shifting to its position that it will be in, right? So, you know, relative to the box. Or, you know, the other hand or whatever it decided to be relative to. Because they're all part of the same glue group. So I'm just going to fix that here because I think you know, that's going to be better to just sort of, oops, turn that off. Better to sort of fix visually. And look at how that, yeah, that's going to be end up being something like that. So AA also says, yeah, like a push-pull and a bot slider, let's say trying to reduce the shake by 50% while going from pose A to pose B. You know, that's actually a very good analogy. Yeah, that's kind of a somewhat similar idea. Also, when creating a breakdown, it's the box driving the rest. So here's actually something that I want to, that's a thing I want to address, which is this question of, well, when you are making a breakdown or using any other blend that involves everything in a glue group, which thing is driving? And right now, the user doesn't have any control over that. And that's usually fine, because it's just like, you know, when we do a breakdown with the feet, and we do it in forward mode and the feet pass through the ground and you just redo that bit. So it's not usually a huge deal, but it is a case where I think it may make some sense to offer a little control there, where you could say, for instance, that when blends use all nodes is on, but like the hand is selected, that it's always going to be the driver. Right now it's going to chooses one at random. Turn that off. There we go. So the idea here is that, you know, he's losing control of it. So it's gonna swing around, and it's swinging him around too. So it's gonna lead his motion a bit. Let's see where this foot's gonna go. Because the idea here is he's like stumbling back, getting that other foot under him to catch himself. So we probably want that foot. Do we want it to already be in place? Maybe. I mean, that's kind of a weird pose, but I think that's kind of okay, right? This is a like in between, kind of a crazy thing happening situation. But you know what I actually want to do with this is kind of put it up like this, like it's on the way there. You can't really see that. Let's see if I can. Yeah, maybe I'll bring this up a little bit here because I think you do kind of want to see what the feet are doing there. Because right now, right, that'll end up. I actually want to bring that up a little bit more. No, you know what? I think it actually does have to come fully down onto the ground in that pose. Because otherwise, because you really need this foot, like this foot can't be on the ground at that point. And while both feet could leave the ground at the same time, very briefly, that ends up like kind of looking like a hop, right? And we don't want it to happen too closely. So I think that do it for too long. So I think I will bring that down. Like he's having to scoot this foot way over, and he actually will shift his hips a little bit to fit, in order to like catch his weight. And then what's the other foot going to be doing? The other foot has now left the position where it was currently. I mean, actually, this is probably more or less what it is. Like it'll become more clear with more poses, but like it's got to be like it came off the ground and it's coming around because it's going to end up in that position. Should it be like down here like this maybe or something? Maybe. Because it could come up into that position potentially pretty quickly. Like he's kind of like doing this like stumbling move is the idea. So he could be, I don't know, we'll see what happens. We can refine that a bit more as we figure out what's going on. So again, I'm thinking about the arc of this and how that's going to work with his shoulders and everything. Maybe more like that, actually. He is kind of surprised by this and alarmed. Here, I'm going to put something back on model using just translate and using 0. Push that back. So you can imagine, like, as I sort of start figuring out the timing here, he actually will come up more quickly into this pose. And then, like, there'll be, like, a tiny bit of hang time. And then he starts to lose control of it and it swings around. I'm going to, like, this whole thing here with the arms, I don't like. I need to push it further out. I need to angle his body more. And I need to pull I kind of pushed that, like, so far in that it's kind of, like, producing kind of a weird shape. Yeah, I actually really need to pull that. You know what I'm going to do? Because like his other hand, so it's actually going to be like this. Maybe like that. Yeah. Now we're getting somewhere. Very often when you have characters holding on to things and the things like move around, this is one of those things that makes conventional constraints and stuff such a pain when they're in one direction, is that the thing is going to change its position. The character's hand is going to change its position relative to the thing. And, now you have to manage all that. Whereas here, you can just be like, again, it works the same way from either direction. Trying to make a little bit more of a graphic shape with that arm. Although, actually, the more I think about it, now I'm looking, I see what to do with this. See, the issue here is I've had this idea that it leads his motion, but this really isn't quite right. Because, like, yeah, it's got a lot of momentum, and it's dragging him with the momentum, right? That's kind of how it's going to end up here. But really, it's got to lag a little bit, too, as he's trying to shift his weight underneath it. Yeah, this whole pose is wrong. This happens all the time, right? This whole pose is wrong. Like that's part of animation. Because what we really need here is yeah, okay, I think we're getting somewhere now. It's like he's whipping it. It's like it starts to overbalance him. He's going to end up having to, like, he's going to start overbalancing like up here somewhere. I might actually start doing that pose right now. Because that'll help lead me into like what this next pose is going to do. Yeah, I'm starting to see how this can work. All right, actually, I'm gonna do a slight blend here. Actually, I'm gonna do a bias it a little bit there, but then I'm gonna put this foot back where it's supposed to be, and that foot is gonna have to come around into this position. So I think, does it come behind his other foot? Let me think about that for a second. I don't know. I'll deal with that in a minute, because the real thing I want to do is to figure out how this movement is going to work. Because he's starting to seriously overbalance at this point. Yeah, this is working better. So he comes up there. Oh, this is not working. Here, let's I think that I do want to adjust this a little bit. So he's obviously imminently going to fall over. So to deal with that issue, he has to shift his weight completely, which means that actually what I want here is a real graphic sort of thing here where, yeah, whoa, he has to whip it around. This is starting to work much better for me. I'm actually really glad this happened, because I feel like it's a really good illustration of like being able to be experimental. Do you get it right immediately? No, of course not. Not all the time. Sometimes, if you're lucky. Here, it's totally okay to have it be like ridiculous, because this is a ridiculous pose, and also it doesn't look quite as ridiculous from this view. I might even enhance that a little bit. Oh, there we go. Ryan Craig says, without curves or a graph editor at all, how would we be able to make the motions different, such as linear or splined, for example? These motions can be different. Well, in a sense, they're not, right? Because ultimately, what the viewer sees is frames, right? The viewer does not see the curves in your graph editor. All the viewer sees is, where is the character at each frame? That's all that, ultimately, that is the only thing that matters. Now, the deal with curves in a graph editor is they can be a quick way to change the character of your motion, right? You know, and actually they're very good at that when it comes to things like motion graphics. Because if you are doing motion graphics with, you know, you'd have like this sort of control over slow in and slow out, and that can be a valuable thing. But ultimately, what happens in your graph editor doesn't matter at all, right? It has essentially no effect. Like, well, I mean, it has an effect, right? Because that's how the means you're using to generate your actual ultimate frames that are going to get rendered and your audience sees. But by itself, it doesn't mean anything. And so all that really matters in terms of those different characteristics of motion is what the motion actually looks like. And the ephemeral system gives you the freedom to sort of like depending on how you choose. Like if I in between something, and I just like did it straight, and I did it for like a whole bunch of frames at once, and I didn't really pay any attention to Like, I don't know, like let me actually do that for one of these poses, like just as an illustration purpose. Like let me get all of these. I've got glue active off because you would want it to be off at this point. I'm going to do it in default mode. I'm going to use blends all nodes. I'm going to do it per frame. I'm going to do it for every frame, right? Right, so that's a linear motion. Of course, it pops back here because, I didn't in between this bit, but, that's purely linear. This is the same thing as using a linear thing. Now, of course, usually speaking, you don't want things that are this perfectly linear. It doesn't look any good, right? And so the equivalent of spline in this context isn't really about the specific characteristics of a spline. It's about how do the poses work together to produce the kind of ease that you want. And you have tools that sort of help you do that. So like if you need to smooth out motion, which is sort of ostensibly like kind of what splines are for, then using smooth tools to like get rid of like little kinks in motion gives you something that's similarly smooth. So ultimately, I think that the idea of relying on different types of interpolation types or on tweaking interpolation in order to change the characteristics of your motion is a bit of a dead end. Like, it's not like you can't do it, but there is a reason why people have tended to gravitate, as time has gone on, animators have, towards doing a lot of blocking. And it's specifically because that method of controlling the characteristics of your motion is very indirect and very actually hard to control and very hard to get a specific result with.
There's something about what you said about the motion graphics,
yeah,
which is that there's a sense in which you wouldn't really need, for instance, ephemeral animation to animate a bouncing ball, for instance, right? A bouncing ball, it needs a little squash and stretch, and it needs some ease. But there's no relationship between its parts, right? And so a spline is perfect for dealing with that because dealing with ease and dealing with some squash and stretch and those kinds of like sort of physical quantities like that, that's something that splines model really, really well. But with a character with all these poses, there's a lot of relationships between the different parts of the character, right? And those relationships are an awful lot of the complexity of it. I mean, whether you're talking about sort of the arc through space, they're being controlled by sort of whether it's FK or IK, there is this sort of hierarchy of things. So it seems to me that there's something there about that. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
I mean, I think it basically does. I mean, that's similar to a lot of the stuff that we've talked about in terms of the simplicity of controls versus or the simplicity of what you do with motion graphics versus the complexity of what characters do. This is this concept of specific complexity, right? That the thing about a bouncing ball or many other types of things that are in a sense sort of more motion graphicsy, although of course bouncing balls can have personality that kind of straddle the line there, but even so it's not that hard to control with a graph editor, is that it is about not just that there's a lot of interrelating parts in a character, because that is absolutely what there is in a character, but then at the same time you can see a lot of motion graphic stuff that you might produce with like Mash or Cinema 4D or something, where you are essentially building up fairly complex motion with complex interrelationships in some respects, and that you really do want to control procedurally and do want to use conventional types of keyframing for, and the difference there is the specificness of the control. Is maybe a good way of putting it. So let's see if I can think of a good way of sort of describing what I mean by that. Characters move in a very specific way. If you have a particle system or some other kinds of motion graphicsy thing where you've duplicates of a mesh and they're doing some kind of twirling around or something, that's all led by this procedural system, the movement of any one piece of it is not the point, right? No piece of it needs very specific control usually. It's the whole thing having one specific idea. But every piece of a character has to move in a very specific way. That's sort of part of the point of how the character expresses itself. It's not...
I think that's That's kind of where I was going, I
Yeah,
think, a
yeah.
little bit with the relationships. I mean, there's a specific kind of relationship. It's like, well, it's a little bit, it goes back to like, I always think of that time watching you animate that shot on Caldera where you just back animating that elbow over and over and over and
Yeah.
over again, right? It's like,
Yes.
it is very specific. And the problem is every time you move the hand, the elbow moves, right?
Yup.
That's kind of what I'm getting at. And that doesn't tend to come up in motion graphics. You kind of do want, yeah, you want this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you have this sort of thing twirling, and some of the stuff is like a little bit behind, so it twirls behind. But that's sort of this very specific thing that simple mathematical functions model well.
Right, exactly. And that's a big part of the issue, right? Is that we've sort of mistaken to a great degree the utility of procedural ways of looking at things as being always true. Like correct, because it is often correct to do things procedurally because it is often useful. Therefore, that's the idea. And to be clear, like when we talk about keyframe systems, like that's procedural, right? It's not really what we mean when we say procedural animation. It's hand keyed, but it is fundamentally procedural. It has a set of inputs, they're anim curves, and a whole system is going to interpret those inputs and procedurally come out with your final result. So it's fundamentally procedural. And things that are fundamentally procedural are great for some I mean, they're amazing for some classes of problems. And they are really the wrong thing for other classes of problems. I mean, like I have ranted about this multiple times on my blog and stuff, but fundamentally it comes down to like, there's a reason why ZBrush, which was, basically here's a big ball of micropolygons that are like kind of undifferentiated. That's not really quite true, but it got increasingly more true as more tools got added and things like Dynamesh got, added and stuff. It's like you've got this big bunch of data and you've got good tools for pushing it around. And that is not what I think anyone in the early 2000s expected to be the way characters were going to get modeled. You had all of these, yeah.
And some of this goes back to locality of control. And
Yeah.
we've talked about this a little bit too, which is there's a set of trade-offs with splines that you make. But one of them is that you often are trading off locality. That is to say, if you move a control point of a spline, you're not just affecting the segment of the spline between the surrounding control points, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to retain some kind of continuity in the spline, you're necessarily making changes on the other sides of the spline. And there's a bunch of trade-offs that you make about how much locality you have, right? Like some splines change all the way up and down them no matter how many control points you have, right?
Yep.
And if you want C2 continuity, it's pretty hard to avoid that. So I'm sorry, I'm getting a little into the math of it here, but that locality is a problem, and that's part of where you get like rig behavior where you do get that elbow moving. That elbow moves because it has to, because you don't have that locality of control. And if you take that locality of control back, then you have a different set of issues, right? And that's the relationship between the two things, but it's also true of positions in space,
Yeah.
right, over time. So there's a spatial element of locality there, and then a temporal element of locality.
Okay, so I'm finally getting a handle on like how I want this motion to run, which again I kind of feel was, and I realize this now, it's getting super late, but I don't have as an immediate other obligation like I have had on some occasions, so I kind of want to get a little further with this. No, that was not the pelvis. There we go. Which is that you can so really like this is a perfect example of like the kind of mistake that is like I make all the time, even though like theoretically you'd think I would know better, right? So we had those series of poses earlier, and I was looking at them and saying, I think I see how these will go together, but it's not really very clear yet. I better add some more because I'm not really sure about what I'm doing. And the reason why I wasn't sure about what I'm doing, as it turns out, is because what I was doing at that time would not have worked. That was not actually, that motion that I was envisioning was not going to work. And a really good indication of that is that I'd already put down 3 or 4 poses, but if you just looked at them without seeing sort of what I was envisioning, you'd be like, I don't see how this is going to all go together, right? And one of the skills that I had to learn as an animator is to pull back from your perception and look at what's there. And indeed, and this used to be so hard for me, and it still is hard, right? But like, I looked at what was there, and I was able to thankfully come up with the idea that like, and I'm sort of tweaking around with this stuff, but like what was there is not good. It's not going to work. This is going to work. Like, there's plenty of stuff still to be filled in here, but if you look at this concept, like, and like ignore like what that foot's doing because that's totally wrong, but like, doesn't it feel you know, and like there's so much more questions about like how these arcs are going to work that I'm still going to work out, and like how exactly is it going to like crest that thing. But isn't it so much more like you can look at this, and isn't that so much clearer, right? You know, you can see where this motion is going, and that's like a big aspect of, you know, and so here's the important bit. Here's why experimenting in this way with the ephemeral system is easy, right? One way to deal with that would be try to do some thumbnails and then, you know, like encounter that problem then when you're just scribbling, right? But I do like the ability, and it becomes necessary to pivot while you're doing stuff. And it was super easy to do that. It really was not a big deal, right? I'm still kind of working on it, but you know, when we did it while we were talking, like it wasn't really a huge thing to sort of pivot and go to like a different way of a different concept of what was going to happen here. I'm refining this here because so much of how this feels is going to come down to this arc that the box is making, and I want to sort of like really hone in on that right now and build the rest of the poses around that. But yeah, I mean, being able to change stuff, really important. Making it easy to change stuff, really critical, you know? So, a few more questions, and I think we're going to be done for today. AA says, so to get perfect ease, we will have to bake on ones. Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to, if you want something on ones, it will need to be on ones. Like, that's basically what it comes down to. I mean, you have the tools to ease however close your poses are. But if you want something that is smooth, like, well, something that's on ones, then you need to be on ones. But, and an ease that is not on ones is on some level, I suppose, sort of inherently not perfect. But I think that imperfection is desirable, at least for some styles, right? AA also says, if we have a scenario where we need a bouncing ball-like animation of body hips control with very few keys, would it be possible to let it drive the rest of the ephemeral rig in stepped while being able to retime bounces or heights on the body hip control? So here's what I would say to that. I would say, so here's the question. When you're saying we need a bouncing ball-like animation of body hips control with very few keys, you're thinking about the body as being separate from the rest of you're thinking about the hips as being separate from the rest of the character. And there are perhaps a few scenarios where I think that makes sense. But generally speaking, I really think it doesn't. Because they're really, with a character, I mean, this is why a character is different from a bouncing ball, right? For a bouncing ball, that's perfectly fine, right? For a character, though, like, when are the character's limbs not also affecting its body? When does the movement of that body not depend on other things in the scene, probably other parts of the character, in addition to it affecting them? There's no directionality like that in a character's movement. Your hips are affecting your upper body, sure, they're also being affected by the movement of the legs. They're also affecting the movement of the legs.
This is what I was getting at about the relationships, by the way.
Those are not actually separable, right? So I would not say that is how this should work, right? Now, what you do want is good tools to be able to retime that stuff, to make those kinds of changes that you want to make very quickly with a graph editor, similarly quickly. That's where having the ability to do an offset and apply it to only a region, perhaps with some fall off, is going to be really valuable. But ultimately, this is sort of what I think about that.
Right. I'll also say that I think, although we don't have the full tool set for doing that yet, that I think that there's no reason with the ephemeral stuff that you can't ephemerally put a spline through things.
That's
right. I don't know that it's necessarily the right thing, but there's no technical reason. And I think for some things, it's probably a very useful thing to be able to do, to say, well, okay, make all of these things fall on this spline and then give me a representation of the spline and let me manipulate that ephemerally. But the thing is, it goes away when you're done with it, right? And it's back to being poses.
Like that's how I would imagine an ephemeral graph editor working, right? Like you have something perhaps using splines that fit to your data and then give you some control points to move, but you're not making any assumption, and this is, I think, the critical thing, you're not making any assumption that wherever you put those control points for what you're doing right now has to matter in the future. Whereas, of course, when you set keys on a spline, it always matters, right? That's what the spline is always interpolating. And the ideal here is you manipulate things and whatever things make sense for what you're doing right now, which could very well mean fitting a spline to your like body hip movement and putting some specific points of articulation so you can make a particular change, but it doesn't have to stick around and it has no implications for the future. So when you're saying, or let's say if this was happening on a moving train or with some animated environment, that's a bit of a different case. So that's a moving platform, as it were. And that the ephemeral system is perfectly fine with. What essentially that means, if you're on a train or in a spaceship or like whatever, is the whole system and all of its math is happening inside a local space, which is that's perfectly fine. Like I've got a local control here that I could use to reposition all of this animation. Here, just yeah. If I go and move this, I've moved all the ephemeral animation. Nothing is a problem. It's just repositioned the whole thing. Nothing ephemeral happened at all, because all of these ephemeral controls, they have to be in the same space, but that space does not have to be world. So there is no reason whatsoever. If you've got a character in a spaceship, by all means, use conventional keys on your spaceship. Have the character be relative to the spaceship. That's perfectly fine. That's not a problem. Where it is potentially an issue, and this is a little awkward with interactions between ephemeral rigging and other kinds of rigs, is that you can make your whole ephemeral rig relative to anything you want, but you can't make parts of it relative to different things. It's always, and if you interact with a prop or another character, as long as two ephemeral rigs don't interact, like you never glue them together, like we're doing here with the cube, that they can be in different spaces, that it's not a problem. The moment you do glue them together, that's a big problem, because it only knows about its local space. Now, that's a problem that we might be able to deal with. Like maybe we can check for if the spaces are not congruent and we can account for it. So there's possible ways of dealing with that problem. But it's also conceptually works against a little bit the idea of these poses. So that is one thing where the conventional workflow, where you probably have like a bunch of different things in a bunch of different spaces and you don't really care, like the ephemeral system does impose this idea of like, well, anything that interacts with something else, you've got to consider what space it's in. However, it really is okay. Like, let's say you've got a dogfight thing, and you've got like one character inside one spaceship, and like you're shooting it from the side, so you can see like the other guy in the other spaceship, and they're two different ephemeral characters, and they're in two different spaces because you're conventionally keying the ships. No problem at all. That's perfectly fine. The only issue is going to happen if you've got like a character attached to a moving train and another character tries to grab them or something. That's the only case where you're going to end up having some sort of issue there. And that's sort of unfortunate and is partly caused by the fact that we're not really designing this system from scratch, right? We're working on top of another system, Maya, with very different assumptions. And so it is like there are absolutely corner cases that come out of that require a bit more work. I just think that for all the benefits it gets you, it's like the amount of extra work you'd have to do for like to account for stuff like that, absolutely dwarfed by the huge advantages in terms of animation speed in every other case, right? So yeah, there are a few caveats in that respect, but those kinds of scenarios, in my view, aren't likely to come up all that often. So I will say time for a couple more questions, and then I have to go. One more from AA. Technically, if I animate that local master as a hip control and spline, I apologize in advance. Is there a way to zero it out and bake it while keeping the poses the same? I'm not quite sure what you mean in terms of baking it. Now, one possibility you have here, if you really wanted to do that, is that you could indeed have a local control just like that. You could spline it, and you could bake that information to the ephemeral controls, and then continue on with ephemeral animation. That is possible. You could do that. It's not the worst idea to have a tool that does that, actually. There's no particular reason you couldn't. It's just a matter of basically taking... I mean, all that really is, right, is taking the matrices on each pose for each of the ephemeral controls in world space and converting it to local space. Because you're basically saying, now instead of being attached to this thing, I just have, all of my world space matrices for each of these poses included that thing's, because it's in world space, included that thing's transformation. So yeah, I mean, you could do that. It wouldn't really be that difficult. I do think that it would probably have limited application, but it would be pretty easy to set up. So maybe it's worth doing. AA also says these demos are amazing. Thank you. I certainly hope that they are. And I hope that they're helpful to people. And I hope that we will, it's taken a long time to get through this little shot. because of how much time I've spent at ranting. I hope that that's actually helpful, because one of the things that I do kind of want to show is how sort of fast this could be. I'm not quite sure if people are getting that, because we spent like 2 hours on this and we got like not all that much done actually. If I wasn't constantly talking about stuff, like we'd be so far ahead. But I hope that's
True. I mean,
right.
on some level, like this would probably have taken. This is about 15 minutes of animation, right?
It's
Something
probably
like
more
that.
than that, but it's not that
More than
long.
that.
Like,
Yeah.
um, like now, and then we did some tweening on some of this stuff. Oh, you mean what I did just today? Oh yeah, no, that's like 15
Yes.
minutes. Right, I
Just
was gonna
today.
say
Yeah.
like all the other stuff. Like, no, that would have taken more than 15 minutes. It's maybe an hour or something. I don't know, but maybe a little more than that. But no, what I did today, yeah, no, that would have been like 15 minutes. In actual practice. And that's this valuable thing of being able to be like, oh, I kind of, I did something and then I changed my mind. I realized that what I was trying to do wasn't actually a good idea, and that was perfectly okay. And then I changed it, right? And I see especially younger animators who have like, are sort of just getting into it, struggling so hard with like, I made choices and now I'm stuck with them. And that's one of the things, and like, even if I was making changes to this thing that's already been, like in between a bunch, like if I decided I wanted to like change some part of this and I just blew away some poses and then just like in between it and did some other stuff, also not a big deal, right? Being painted into a corner, it's one of the most critical problems in CG animation. It's one that animators spend endless time trying to avoid, and it's like horrific to the artistic the critical artistic aspects of animation. So anyway, that's all I can do today. Thank you guys for showing up. Please like and subscribe. Bring all your friends next time. I look forward to seeing you next week at this time. Maybe that time I'll actually get a little further and rant a little less.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for coming by. Thank you, Raph.
Yep.
And we'll see you next time.
Yep. See you guys then.